8,000 years ago, when the earth still felt young and the air over the ancient African valley carried the smell of damp soil and wild grass, small bands of early humans moved slowly through the waking jungle, their bare feet pressing quiet paths into the dark, cool ground as the first pale line of sunrise brushed the horizon and lit the mist that floated between tall trees, rocky outcrops, and winding rivers. The valley opened like a wide bowl, surrounded by distant hills, their silhouettes softened by layers of morning haze. And in this space, men, women, and children learned to bend the raw land into shelter as they searched for clay, water, food, and firewood, with patient, repeated movements that turned survival into a steady rhythm. Along the banks of a sluggish river, where reeds whispered in the breeze and dragonflies glided close to the surface, several figures knelt and dug their hands into the sticky earth, feeling the cool, heavy weight of clay in their palms, lifting it out in damp clumps that glistened in the early light, before dropping it into woven baskets made of reeds and twisted fibers. Others waded into the shallow water, legs splashed by small silver fish that darted between their ankles, while they searched the riverbed for stones smooth enough to serve as pounding tools, or flat enough to become the bases of future hearths, stacking them on the shore beside heaps of clay as the sun slowly rose higher and warmed their shoulders. Nearby, tall grass rolled like waves in the light wind, and hunters with lean, sinewy bodies slipped through it with quiet steps, eyes fixed on faint antelope tracks pressed into the damp soil, their breath even and controlled, their hands closing firmly around long wooden spears tipped with sharpened stone. In the distance, small antelope moved cautiously between acacia trees, their ears flicking at the tiniest sounds, while the hunters advanced and retreated with practiced patience, sometimes standing motionless for long stretches, sometimes dropping low to let the grass swallow their silhouettes, always listening to the layered sounds of insects, birds, and rustling leaves. Over and over they practiced the same slow approach, the same pause, the same controlled rush, sometimes returning with meat slung over their shoulders, sometimes returning empty-handed but still alert, still studying the land, the wind, and the hidden paths of their prey. Near a cluster of large boulders, where the ground rose slightly above the surrounding plain, a different group worked to prepare a place for the first clay huts, scraping away loose stones, roots, and clumps of stubborn grass, flattening the earth with repeated strokes of heavy branches and stone pounders, until the surface felt stable underfoot. They chose this spot carefully, high enough to escape sudden floods, close enough to water for easy carrying, and open enough to feel the constant breath of the wind that would later dry the walls and sweep cooking smoke away from their resting places. Thin tree trunks cut from nearby thickets were dragged across the clearing, their bark rough against calloused hands, then set upright in circular patterns, each post buried deep in the ground and packed tight with soil and smaller stones so that the frames would not sway when the wet clay walls pressed against them. Around these forming circles, younger members of the group carried armfuls of long, dry grass, dropping them in piles for future roof thatching, while older builders moved between the clay heaps and wooden frames, their bodies streaked with mud, shaping the first low walls by spreading thick layers of clay along the posts in slow, deliberate strokes. Fingers pressed and smoothed, palms slapped and pushed, thumbs carved shallow grooves to help new layers cling, and gradually shapes rose from the flat earth, curved and enclosing, turning air into shelter. The work was repetitive but calming, a steady cycle of walking from river to hut site, lifting heavy baskets, scooping clay, pressing it, smoothing it, stepping back to study the form, then repeating the process again and again as the sun crossed the sky.
Smoke from a small central fire curled upwards, carrying the smell of damp wood and roasted roots, as another group knelt around it, tending embers and preparing food for the builders and hunters who would return tired and hungry. They laid flat stones around the fire to create a ring where pots carved from hollowed gourds and clay could rest securely, filling them with river water, sliced tubers, wild greens, and scraps of smoked meat saved from earlier hunts, allowing the mixture to simmer slowly while fat cracked and hissed in the heat. Children sat nearby, weaving grasses into simple mats, their fingers moving quickly as they watched the adults work, learning patterns of survival without words, absorbing the rhythm of gathering, building, and cooking as naturally as breathing. When the heat grew strong near midday, some humans moved into the thin shade cast by half-built walls, resting on piles of dried grass while still shaping small clay objects with lazy hands, forming bowls, simple figures, or rounded weights that could hold down roofing layers once the huts were finished. Light filtered through drifting dust, catching on particles of ash and tiny insects, turning the air itself into something visible, almost touchable, as the valley hummed softly with life. Farther from the building site, a small team walked along the floodplain where the river widened and slowed, using simple woven nets and sharpened sticks to catch fish that glittered beneath the surface. They stood knee-deep in the water, bodies reflected alongside the ghostly shapes of fish and reeds, moving slowly so as not to alarm their prey, then striking sharply when a shadow drew near.
The fish were cleaned on flat stones, their scales scraped away, their insides removed and dropped into the river for scavenging creatures to devour, before the cleaned bodies were threaded onto thin green branches to be carried back and smoked over the waiting fire. In another corner of the valley, women and older children wandered beneath fruit-bearing trees, filling woven bags with wild berries, nuts, and small fruits, tasting some as they worked, discarding others that proved too bitter or strange. They broke open nuts with stone hammers, listening to the sharp cracks echo off nearby rocks, and smelled the pale flesh inside to test whether it was safe to eat, building knowledge through repeated experiment and careful memory. As the day moved forward, new layers of clay were added to the hut walls, each one slightly thinner than the last, making the structures stronger as they grew higher. Long grasses were dipped in muddy water and laid across the tops of the frames, then covered with more clay, pressed and smoothed until the roofs curved gently downward, ready to shed rain. At moments, a builder would pause to run a hand slowly across a half-dried wall, feeling the warmth of the surface where the sun had baked it, and the coolness beneath where the clay remained damp, judging how much longer it would take before the hut could be safely used. Between these tasks, the people moved in familiar loops that repeated day after day. They returned to the river to gather more clay, returned to the trees to collect more poles, returned to the grasslands to cut more thatching material, each journey accompanied by the same sounds of swishing grass, crunching leaves, and distant animal calls. They checked traps set earlier along small game paths, sometimes finding a rabbit or small antelope tangled and struggling, sometimes finding only disturbed earth and broken twine that told of prey that had escaped. Smoke thickened above the camp as fish, meat, and tubers cooked, carrying a smell that drifted through the valley and drew circling birds overhead. In quiet pauses between bursts of work, individuals sat and stared at the nearly completed huts, eyes following the lines of the walls and roofs as if imagining the shade, warmth, and security they would soon offer. They envisioned nights when rain would drum on the clay roofs while fires burned safely inside, days when the huts would cast cool shadows on the ground where children could play without the sun burning their skin, mornings when they would step out from the doorways to survey gardens of wild plants they had chosen and protected. As the first hut neared completion, they smoothed the interior floor with a mixture of clay and fine sand, pressing it flat with broad stones and bare feet until it became a firm, level surface. A small circular pit was left at the center, lined with stones for an indoor hearth where future fires would burn low and steady. The entrance was kept low, forcing any person who entered to bow slightly, which helped keep the interior warm and signaled a shift between the open world outside and the protected space within. Around the hut, narrow drainage channels were carved into the earth, leading away downhill so that rainwater would not pool at the base and weaken the walls. The same careful pattern was repeated as they began the second and third huts, moving from frame building to clay gathering to wall shaping with the same patient repetition, their bodies learning the efficient paths between river, forest, and clearing. As shadows lengthened in the late afternoon, hunters returned once more from the grassy plains, carrying a small antelope, several birds, and a handful of gathered roots. Their skin gleamed with sweat and dust, their muscles tired but relaxed, their eyes constantly alert to movement in the distance. Tuned,